This is Dr. Lisa Marie Bobby, and you're listening to the Love, Happiness, and Success podcast. Fier Bentinu with Loosen My Grip. I thought that song would be the perfect mood setter for us today as we tackle today's topic, which is how to find balance in a world and life circumstances that are trying to haul us to the edges in terms of extreme ways of being and thinking and feeling, which are all justifiable and understandable under the circumstances, but not always in our best interests. In contrast, I am a firm believer in the idea that there is light and dark in all things, and that every perspective and stance has value and has merit. What starts to create problems for people, though, is when they get pushed so far into extreme ways of being or wanting certain kinds of relationships or practices or mindsets that they run the risk of blocking themselves from the value and strengths that alternative perspectives and ways of being can provide. And so I think that for all of us, part of our growth work is to find and create a healthy balance so that we can draw from the best practices available to us, that we can take the best of everything and then knit together a way of being and a lifestyle and a set of personal practices and relational practices that really strengthen us and nourish us and allow us to be the highest and the best. And in order to do this, it requires balance. And I think step one of achieving that balance is to understand what the alternatives are. What are the spectrums, if we were to imagine that there is like a continuum in many different domains, how do we all understand what that center is or center-ish stance is so that we can then cultivate it intentionally? And of course, as the late, great Oscar Wilde said, everything in moderation, including moderation, that there might be certain things we're like, no, I think that actually it would be best for me to go all in that aspect of life. But as long as you're doing it intentionally and consciously, it can still be for the best. So that's where we're going today. And I have the most fascinating person to talk with us on exactly this topic. Dr. Michele Gelfand is a cultural psychologist, social psychologist who has done such interesting research on exactly this topic, differences in perspectives and cultures and relational stances and negotiation tactics even. And she is here with us today to share her wonderful advice on how to understand these differences and then use that awareness to create balance. So I'm so excited to be speaking with her today. And before we jump into talking with Dr. Michele, I do also want to take a moment. I have realized that I've gotten a little bit out of balance with the podcast and talking to you because I have such a great time and I get so excited about our topics and I plunge right in. And I have been remiss because I have not shared another amazing resource for you, which is just not okay. So, I am the founder and clinical director of Growing Self Counseling and Coaching, which you may know. And our group is about so much more than me. I love doing this podcast. It's kind of my personal project. But the fact is that I work with some really smart and interesting and talented therapists and coaches who are also working just as hard as I am to support you on your path of growth. And for example, we have a very active blog at growingself.com. And my colleagues contribute articles to this all the time. And this is really good stuff. And just between you and me, we have people get in touch with us all the time. And they're just like, random writers or whatever. And they're very well intentioned, but they're like, hey, I want to write a relationship piece for your blog. And no, we do not allow any of that, because I don't want some self-proclaimed, writer or blogger or whatever to be trying to offer meaningful advice to you, because this is going to make me sound probably elitist, but I want you to have the very best. And so we only allow people on our team who are highly educated and incredibly experienced and know exactly what is going on and have the not just education, but have walked with couples and individuals through this path of growth over and over and over again. They really know what's going on and the specific things that will help you. That is the only thing that we allow on our blog. And I've realized that I haven't been talking about that lately, and there's so much good stuff for you on there right now. So, for example, my colleague Jessica is a marriage and family therapist, and she just released an article recently about tips from her perspective as a parenting coach about how to survive quarantine with kids. My colleague Rachel just released an amazing article about how to create community during this time so that you can feel less isolated, honestly. And I have Amy Noel Shee. I know that she was on the program with me not too long ago. She wrote a wonderful piece about how to not panic in the panic using intentional mindfulness skills, which is just so wonderful. And then, of course, my amazing colleague Kathleen just released a super cool article about emotional self-care when you feel like things are falling apart all around you. What are specific, actionable things that you can do to take care of yourself? And then last but not least, my colleague Dory, who you may have heard on this program in the past, her specialty is sex therapy. And she just released an amazing article talking about the challenges that couples can face when they're feeling stressed and how to not allow that to impact your sex life. And also some tips about how to keep that part of your relationship healthy and strong when you're together 24/7. So I just wanted to share that there is so much more going on than me and then this podcast, and it is all for you. It's at growingself.com. Just come on over, and then you'll click on the resources tab of our website to access all of the free information and articles and advice that we have for you, because there is much more than this. Okay, I personally feel more imbalanced now that I've shared that with you. And let's move on to our topic today about how to create balance in other aspects of your life. So my guest on today's show is Dr. Michele Gelfand. She is a researcher into all kinds of fascinating topics, and she has a lot to offer in terms of understanding ourselves and the world right now, and also, I think, some of our relational issues too. So, Michele, I'm thrilled. Is it okay to call you Michele, or do you prefer Dr.
No,
Gelfand?
Michele is great. Just with one L, though.
One L. Got it. Well, so to start, why don't you tell my listeners just a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. So I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Maryland. I'm a native New Yorker originally, and I'm studying basically how people vary around the world and within the country in terms of their culture. And culture is a really fascinating topic because it's omnipresent, it's all around us, but it tends to be invisible. We take it for granted. And it's only when we kind of step outside of our cultures that we realize that we've been so profoundly socialized into a culture. And so I've been spending the last couple of decades trying to understand what are the deeper codes that drive our behavior. And I do this to understand not just how we differ, but why we differ around the world. And that's kind of to try to help people understand sometimes cultural differences make a lot of sense given the context that people are in. And also, I study negotiation and conflict. So I try to understand how does culture and other factors like gender or race or ethnicity, how does that affect how we approach conflicts and negotiate? And of course, negotiations are really super important skill. We negotiate constantly. And so that's kind of what I do. And I do a lot of research, train students, and also teach classes at UMaryland.
You are a busy woman. You have a lot going on, and you have so many different interesting research projects and publications. And it's kind of funny because when I first reached out to you, it was because I had come across an article about a research project that you did that was very specifically looking at how the nature of our relationships can either impact it and enhance our personal growth process, or in some ways limit it. And that was the whole reason that I got in touch with you in the beginning. And I still really want to talk about that because I think it's fascinating and it's important for everybody to know. But also, Michele, since then, so many different things have happened in the world, because we had to reschedule this conversation like 9 times, which is fabulous. But so many other things have been happening in the world lately that has, I think, made your research even more timely and needed and necessary in understanding like what is happening in different cultures and societies, and the way that countries are reacting to the public health crisis we're all facing. But I think also has a lot of applications to how are we handling this together as a couple and as a family. So we have so much to talk about.
That's right. I'm ready for just anything you want to talk about. I'm up for it.
And I have to just say I am particularly honored to speak with you because so we have been like trying to get together for such a long time. And in the interim, I have to say the last time that we had to reschedule, it was because you were talking to my hero, Shankar Vedantam of the Hidden Brain podcast.
That's right.
I am his #1 fan. Do you know when that episode is going to be coming out?
I'm not sure, but I'll keep you posted. We just recorded the interview late last week, and now they're working on the setup and so forth. So I'll keep you posted, and your audience, your listeners too.
Well, I want my listeners to know that if you want even more Michele, that you have more opportunities. So first of all, let's just talk a little bit about the original thing we were going to talk about, which is the research study that you did that looking at how relationships that feel very subjectively emotionally supportive are not always conducive to our growth, which is different than what we sort of intuitively think and feel and believe. Like we all crave this unconditionally supportive, approving partner or parent or friend or therapist. And your research is saying that is not always in our best interests. Can you just talk a little bit more about your study and the findings there?
Sure. So this is a study that I published with my colleague Ed LeMay and our collaborators in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. And the idea is that we all want our partners to be responsive to us. Being responsive is a really important quality for relationships. It makes us happier. It makes us more committed to our partners. It makes us healthier. But we had the hunch that maybe sometimes that could be detrimental in some contexts, and in particularly the context of trying to resolve conflicts with other people. And, this actually starts with a story because my husband's a lawyer and I'm an academic. And I always, think about times when I would come home, maybe talking about a conflict I'm having with a colleague or someone else. And he would immediately say, well, wait a second. Are you sure those are the facts? He's a lawyer. So he was very specific about kind of thinking about my arguments. And I was like, no, dude, I just want some empathy. That's what I'm looking for right now. And we kind of laugh about it. And, he's like, okay, I'll give you some empathy first, and then we're going to switch to my approach. And,
oh, my goodness.
It was, it kind of got to the point where I said, well, let's start to study this phenomenon. And Ed LeMay and I and our colleagues wound up doing a series of studies where we looked at the fact that when partners when we have close relational others, they really want to be responsive to us. And in conflict situations, when we come home and tell them about a conflict, they think the way to be responsive is to kind of really validate our perspectives. Like, tell us, like, yeah, you're right. That person was really nasty. You know, they did it intentionally. You should watch out for that person. And actually, it has this really important effects. One is that it makes people feel like they're so happy their partner's been so responsive, but it also makes us much more rigid and much more revengeful to the people we're having conflict with. And, you know, you can imagine that this is a context where this is a cycle. Then we feel they're really responsive, so we keep talking to them about our conflicts, and we keep getting more wedded in our views. And, you know, the reality is that what I find is that conflicts are really about stories. If someone tells you a conflict, your partner comes home tonight and tells you a conflict story, you have to say to yourself, wait a second, this is like a narrative. What are they leaving out? What are they elaborating on? And I think in that case, what we could see is that it's, when we start thinking about conflicts as stories, we need to think about the best strategy for trying to validate our partners, but also trying to help them be more objective about their conflicts. And I could tell you about some other stories that we've done studies where we look at conflicts as a telephone game and how it happens when conflicts get passed across individuals. And the big picture is that the original conflict looks nothing like the conflict as it becomes reproduced over individuals. And so I think it's really important to be both simultaneously responsive to our partners, but also to really try to help them think more objectively about the conflicts. What did you do wrong? What did they do right? They kind of flip our natural proclivities to sort of be self-serving in conflict situations. So that's really the gist of what that study was about.
So interesting. And you know, as you're talking more about this, I'm thinking of, so I specialize in couples counseling. And one of the things that we see, and that I believe there is some research behind this that really goes into what you're saying. And if not, there should be. So maybe even another study, but like, when people are in individual therapy or coaching, their relationship tends to have a worse prognosis as opposed to working in couples counseling with like an objective counselor who is able to see sort of both sides of the story. Because if you then kind of go out into individual therapy, it invariably turns into these stories about the latest mean thing my husband did to me, and a therapist is like, wow, he sounds narcissistic, or, you know, like something that
that's
really
exactly,
like
that's exactly
shuts the door. On this like self-reflection around what is his how am I showing up? How does he feel? And that you're saying that research supports that, like, losing that perspective makes it much less likely that you're able to resolve a conflict.
I hadn't even thought about the application of the findings to therapy, and it seems like it's that context is so much more important than even the context we've been studying, because in these contexts, it's being interpersonally responsive is really the job of the therapist. But and it's also, I'm sure, a delicate balance of when we can introduce, like, maybe this conflict narrative is a little biased, and how do we do that, within the constraints of trying to be really interpersonally responsive. So we're trying to study that now. Like, what's the Goldilocks principle, the balance of when we validate, when we start poking holes in stories. Like I mentioned, Todd and I, my husband, we actually talk about this. We explicitly say, okay, we have two goals here. Your goal is to validate and also to make sure I'm being realistic. But let's kind of go with the validation.
Totally. First tell me I'm right. And then I have every reason to be upset and whatever, and then we can talk about other things. I love it.
And I could send you also the paper that came out on conflict narratives was published with Tian Li and Yoshikishima and I in the Journal of Experimental Social Psych, and you could see in that paper what the original conflicts looked like and what they looked like at the end of the chains when people were motivated. They didn't even realize it. This is really unconscious. It's not as though we're sort of thinking about the fact that, no, the story that I just got is actually really biased. We don't realize it, and then we continue to bias it by passing it on in ways. So, I think when you can look at a story objectively and see how it became biased in our own minds, I think that's helpful from from spouses, from therapists, even from mediators. I think mediators are in the job of trying to kind of mediate stories in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, it's like that's how wars start, especially when you get big groups of people with just little bits of information. It turns to like a black and white, good and bad, right and wrong, like victim and villain kind of scenario that makes it very easy for people to feel absolutely justified.
That's right. And our partners, like we mentioned earlier in the conversation, are really helping to moralize those conflicts. They're doing it, and they're actually causing us to be more biased with the more responsive they are, which is pretty ironic.
Yeah.
We do find some situations where that doesn't happen. For example, when your partner is also connected to the person you're having conflict with, they tend to be less likely to validate those negative kind of attributes about the adversary. They still are responsive, as reported by their partners. So there's lots of ways that this might vary, this process. We're just really starting to look at this. There's been very little research on the role of partner responsiveness in the escalation of conflicts.
So interesting. Well, but I love your comment about finding balance, and I could see how even just understanding this process could help couples, like as you do, talk really openly about what's happening. Be like, it feels really good for me when you just agree with everything I say and tell me that I'm right and they were wrong.
So let's go with that first, like 10 minutes of just that. Actually, I have two teenagers, and it's the same issue. It's even more delicate because I think younger individuals, you're trying to really validate, but they're very sensitive. Kids in general, I think. I don't have data on this, but they're very sensitive to wait, why are you taking their side? Yeah. So I think it's, we really super interesting to study this across different age groups. I do want to mention that one of my colleagues in Japan told me, this is N of one, data point, but she said, I don't think this is going to replicate in Japan. So there's really interesting question around, is this something that happens more in cultures like the U.S. that are a little bit more individualistic, whereas it might be that in Japan, because it's more group-oriented, collectivistic, that people are more honest with their partners and they're expecting that. It's unclear whether that's the case, but I always like to say, everything I do, and this kind of gets into my cross-cultural hat, says, wait a second, is this finding universal? Like, just because we found this in the United States, and we did find it across many studies, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to find that in Egypt or Iraq or Japan. So I'm one of these annoying psychologists who's always thinking, wait a second, maybe that's not generalizable. It's not that it's not important, but it just really, we don't know, even in intercultural marriages here, whether or not there are dynamics along these lines that are causing a lot of cultural conflict.
Oh, I absolutely bet it is, and I'd like to talk more about exactly that. But you bring up such a great point, though, of being aware of the context and the culture, and that in different situations, a different approach might be called for. But perhaps before we transition to talking more about culture, maybe just a takeaway for listeners is to just achieve that balance, and maybe potentially almost practice gratitude and appreciation for people who will push back on you a little bit, and for partners, but also I'm thinking a lot about therapy. Honestly, I mean, I've talked to so many people that have, Michelle, spent literally years in therapy with someone who is very affirming and oh, you poor thing. And it has not been effective in helping them make change in their lives, compared to maybe a more coaching model, which is okay, well, what do you want to do about this? What are your goals here? And I think there are also some therapists who are very good at providing challenge in addition to that support. And so just big takeaway, just because something feels good doesn't necessarily mean that it is good for you in terms of a personal development vehicle, let's say. So
that's a great point. I think being really super explicit about it might help. Hey, this situation is about validation, and I'm here to be responsive, and you have me, I have your back. Yeah. But also my job is to help you learn and to help you be your best self. Yes. And that might require a little bit of, kind of thinking about this as a story, and maybe what you might have left out, and maybe what might be exaggerated, and what would the story look like to someone else. I was going to say that one other study that we've done that might be relevant for your audience is on the psychology of forgiveness. Ooh. And I'll just mention the finding quickly, because there's a lot of research on what types of people are more likely to forgive, and situations people are more likely to forgive in. But we looked at what happens when people forgive. What's the psychological consequence of forgiving? Not just in terms of the relationship, but in terms of your own mental state. And we did these crazy studies where we had people think about a time when they forgave someone in one condition. We had in another condition a time when you really were angry at someone or revengeful. And in a different condition, there was a control condition. Think about what you had for breakfast. And then we asked them to jump as high as they could in the laboratory. So it just
literally jump.
Literally jump.
Okay.
And we measured how high they could jump. And what we found is that in the forgiveness prime condition, that's what we call it, a prime, to think about forgiveness, people jumped much higher than in any of the other conditions. And in other studies, they also estimated the slope of a hill. This was done in Singapore. Like, tell us how formidable you think that hill is outside. And again, the forgiving mindset, people actually felt it was actually more doable. And the idea is that when you're forgiving mindset, it gives you many more resources to apply to everyday tasks. So forgiveness is not, in our research at least, it's not just about the relationship. It's like, actually, wow, like, now I have so many more resources to be creative, to be strong.
Yeah.
And I try to think about that whenever I think about a conflict. I'm like, well, I can choose to be revengeful, or I could just be forgiving, because it's actually be better for me. Not to say that all contexts can be like that, but I do want to just mention that forgiveness seems to have this, the metaphor is it kind of, takes something off your back, and in fact, when it comes to cognitive resources, our studies would suggest that it does. It's, it gives you more energy to apply to other tasks outside of the relationship.
I would love to see that study. I wasn't aware of it, but it makes sense. And the fact that, like, physiologically you have more energy, you can literally jump higher. Like, not only is an emotional weight lifted, but your body has more energy, and certainly cognitively. I mean, it takes a lot of energy to ruminate and in those angry emotions. And you're saying, like, forgiveness is not for them, it's for you.
That's right, exactly. Yeah. And again, of course, this is going to vary depending on the conflict. I'm not just going to argue everyone should go ahead and forgive everyone in the world. But
of course,
in contexts where you have a choice, where it's kind of like a moderate or mild conflict, with me, like I was with a colleague, and I just sort of stopped and said, wait a second. Do I want to spend my energy, like you just said, ruminate on this and like waste my energy on this? Or should I just forgive the person, kind of give them some slack? And they must have been going through a tough time. And I'm going to be able to be writing this paper more effectively that I'm working on. So that's kind of a natural way where sometimes I stop myself and say, hey, maybe I'm going to go in a different direction with this.
I love it. Well, and now if this is $1 million question. I'm not sure if you have an answer for this, because this is a big one, but I know that I have like so many listeners, listening to this right now and saying like, okay, but how do I forgive? And I think you dropped, this is how I forgive personally and how I've seen it work. You dropped a little clue in your own narrative when you said, I reach for compassion, I reach for empathy, I try to, give them a break. And, but has your research come up with any explicit, if you want to forgive someone, here are the cognitive shifts that can help you actually do that? Because I think a lot of people theoretically want to, but they do not know how. Yeah,
I think that there's lots of research. We published a paper that kind of summarized many, many different studies out there in terms of the things that lead to forgiveness. And like you mentioned, empathy, perspective taking is a big factor that helps people to forgive.
Yeah.
The kind of lowering one's anger, seeing it from other people's perspective, the rumination issue also is something that's really important. So there are certain factors like that tend to facilitate the process much more. So I think that, and we have a lot of other work on revenge that, is also, on the flip side of that, and how difficult it is to get out of that cycle. Particularly more recently, we just published this paper that's a neuroscience paper that looks at how revenge becomes contagious across individuals. So when you witness your partner or friend being harmed, what kind of neurobiological pathways that affects.
Yeah.
And then we start seeking revenge on people who weren't even originally in the conflict just because they're associated with the adversary. So the big picture is I can send you a couple of papers we have on this topic because, and again, it's really super interesting to look at this cross-culturally also. So that I just want to mention that there's lots of different ways we can explore this topic.
Well, let's talk more about that and your research that really explores different cultures, and so not just research. I mean, you have a TED Talk on this topic, you have a book on this topic. So this is a subject that you've really studied extensively, and so there are many cultural variables. But one of the things that you've been looking at, kind of like broad strokes, is the degree to which cultures are either loose or tight, and what that means and how that impacts the population. And I have been thinking personally a lot about that as we sort of watch what is happening in the world in the way that different countries and cultures are seeking to cope with and respond to the coronavirus. To start, maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about what you mean by loose and tight cultures.
Sure,
Let's start there.
Sure. So I just want to mention that, like many people, like life happens when you make another plan. So I was pre-med when I was in college years ago up at Colgate University, and I really was excited about becoming a doctor, but I had this shift where I decided to become a cross-cultural psychologist based on one phone call.
Really?
And actually, and I'm just going to give you the backdrop and then I can get into tight loose, but basically I was away for a semester in London, and I was the first person to leave New York. I'm a native New Yorker, and I had this kind of typical New Yorker view of the world, which is like, there's New York, there's New Jersey, but then there's the rest of the world, So, and I went away, and I was in a tremendous state of culture shock in London. And I remember calling my father from Brooklyn and confiding in him like all the culture shock I was having, including the fact that people were just going from London to Paris or London to Amsterdam just for the weekend. And I just found the whole situation to be discombobulating. And he said to me, in his New York accent, he said, well, think about it like it's going from New York to Pennsylvania. And I thought that was such a great metaphor that literally the next day I booked a trip to Egypt, like a low-budget tour to Egypt. This is a true story.
Uh-huh.
And that's how I started traveling around the world and realizing I know so little about culture. And therefore, I know so little about myself. And so I came back to the U.S. and I switched gears, found a program in cross-cultural psychology, studied with Harry Triandis, who's one of the pioneering founders of the field in Champaign-Urbana, of all places. And at the time, I thought I'd become a cross-cultural trainer, but then I realized, wow, I can do research on this topic. And the issue is that cultures vary way beyond East versus West or North-South, rich-poor. They vary in terms of how strictly people follow social norms. And so in my work, I differentiate some cultures that are very tight. They have strict rules, and they have punishments for people who deviate from rules, and cultures that are more permissive, that have a wider range of behavior that's permissible. And in the science study that we published on this, we rank ordered countries on this construct. So places like Japan and Singapore and to some extent Germany and Austria veered tighter in our data. And places like New Zealand and Brazil and Greece, the Netherlands, the U.S. veered loose. And of course, all countries have tight and loose elements, but it helped us to understand why do people in Singapore get fined, for example, if they're chewing gum, or if they are spitting on the ground, or even not flushing the toilet in public settings can get you a fine. It's actually called the fine nation, because the fine city, because people can get punished for very seemingly minor offenses. And you go over to New Zealand, you'll see people walking barefoot in banks, and you'll see people burning couches on university campuses. You see it with jaywalking. You go to Germany in general, people are waiting patiently at the corner even when there's no cars coming, whereas in my own home state of New York, people jaywalk incessantly. And so there's lots of ways that, we all have rules. All cultures have social norms or these unwritten rules for behavior, but some countries and some groups, some organizations, some people and households veer tighter or looser. And one of the things that we wanted to understand is why do cultures evolve differently to be tight or loose? And we found a pretty interesting, robust effect, which is that countries that tend to have a lot of threat, think about like Mother Nature, fury, like constant disasters or famine, or countries that have a lot of human threat. Think about, being invaded a lot over the course of your history. Like imagine the U.S. was being invaded by Canada or Mexico for much of its history. When you have a lot of threat, including, by the way, pathogen threat, we measured all of these threats in this study, you need strong rules to coordinate to survive. And when you don't have a lot of threat, you don't need those kinds of rules. You could be a little bit more permissive. And so it makes a lot of sense. For example, Singapore has about 20,000 people per square mile compared to New Zealand that has about 40 or 50 people per square mile and more sheep per capita than people, I've been told. And, Lee Kuan Yew, who was the prime minister of Singapore years ago, said, look, we need some rules, guys. Like, we got to coordinate in this small little space where we have little arable land, we have lots of people, different ethnic groups, where we could have a lot of chaos here.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's why he banned gum, by the way. It looks really ridiculous to Americans that why would you not be able to bring in gum to a country? But what happened in the late 80s is that people were chewing gum, and with so many mouths per capita, they were throwing gum on the ground, and it was causing a mess, including it was blocking sensors for trains and elevators. So he said, hey, guys, we just got to ban this tasty treat.
No gum.
Yeah, no gum. So, the big picture point is that not all tight cultures have threat, not all loose cultures are on easy street. But this is one factor that tends to make sense when you think about why some cultures veer strict versus permissive.
So more rule-bound, having more kind of regulations and tighter social norms versus looser cultures that maybe are freer and where people have more leeway to handle things as they see fit, and that there's a relationship between those cultures and the threat that those cultures are facing, which makes a lot of sense. And so, like, it's. Let me just actually ask you this. And so, look, just watching the news lately, that, China, Singapore, South Korea, so all perhaps cultures that have tighter norms and have a more authoritarian approach, and there are pros and cons of that, certainly, but you sort of watch them being like, okay, everybody, this is what we're going to do, and and that it has worked and it has protected those populations arguably to more effectively in some ways than freer cultures. Like, Italy has a reputation for being like, you and your rules, and or the UK being like, we can go to the pub, or the United States, and when I think about like these cultures and sort of how they tend to thrive and be successful, and like the American myth is that some bright person down on the bottom of the heap somewhere is like, wait, I have an idea, like this MacGyver kind of thing that's going to zoom in and save us all, not through the government telling us what to do, but this like creative, innovative force that that's how we tend to roll. But in this situation, I don't know. I'm curious to know what you've sort of been observing through your lens as you watch this all unfold.
It's a really weird situation to be a cross-cultural psychologist studying threat at this moment in time, because I think it's just such a horribly difficult situation for everybody. And it's unprecedented for people who haven't gone through this in this many decades. I want to just back up and say that, people ask me, like, what's better, tight or loose? And I always try to tell them, and I talk about it in my book. So the book is called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire the World. I wrote this book for my dad, who always said, I can't understand a word you say. So I made sure that it was accessible.
Oh, that's good.
He's a smart guy. He's an engineer, but psychologists tend to have a lot of jargon. So I tried to be really accessible. And what I found in my research is that cultures that are tight or loose, they have distinct advantages. So like loose cultures, to what you were just describing, are really super open. They're like really tolerant to people that are different, immigrants, disabled, different races, religions. They're also more creative. Lots of our studies show that loose cultures tend to have, when you're bending the rules a lot, or you're not attentive to rules, it gives you the freedom to come up with all sorts of great creative ideas. And tight cultures struggle with openness. They're much more ethnocentric, and they're much less creative, especially in terms of idea generation. But tight cultures corner the market on order. So this kind of order-openness trade-off. They tend to have less crime. They tend to have people who are more synchronized. So, for example, people tend to wear more of the same thing, drive the same cars. Even clocks in city streets are more synchronized in tight cultures. We actually studied this. We could see that in loose cultures like Spain or Italy or Greece, you're really not sure what time it is, or Brazil, because the clocks don't agree. And in places like Germany or Japan, Singapore, the clocks are off by milliseconds. And also, tight cultures have order at the individual level. When you live in a context where there's a lot of strong rules and punishments, you learn to manage your impulses. So there's more self-regulation. There's less debt, less obesity, less alcoholism. And it's this that loose cultures struggle with. Loose cultures struggle with order. So it really depends on your criterion. And by the way, we find this at the national level and also the state level. We have a paper where we rank order the 50 states in terms of tight, loose. And we also see that the states vary in terms of how much threat they've had. And so forth. So
I have to ask, what is the tightest and loosest state?
Looser states are places like New York and Massachusetts and California. They're states that had a lot of diversity in their histories. And when you have a lot of diversity, it's harder to agree upon rules. Places that in the South and Midwest, some places in the Midwest like Kansas and the southern states tend to be tighter. They not only have more natural disasters, but they also have people who settled in them early on that came from very strict honor-oriented cultures where there's a lot of rules. Also, organizations vary in this. Think, organizations that need a lot of order and coordination, like airlines and police and nuclear power plants, they veer tight for good reasons. And places that don't have that kind of coordination needs, like, tech, can veer looser.
Yeah.
In the book I talk, and I'm going to get back to the coronavirus in a second, but the book I talk about research that we've done that shows that, while cultures need to veer tight or loose for good reasons, it's the cultures that get too extreme in either direction that actually have problems. So think United Airlines. Like, I wrote an op-ed about this. Like, they need to veer tight, but they arguably are getting too tight, and they need to insert some discretion into that system. It's something I call flexible tightness.
Yeah.
And think about Uber or Tesla. I also have written about this. Like, they should veer loose, but they arguably getting so loose that they couldn't scale up, and they need more structure. But anyway.
It seems like at some level, and I'm thinking, like there's cultures and nations and companies, but also like individuals and families here too. Like, there's a spectrum, I would imagine, between like so controlling and authoritarian that it's, I don't want to use the word abusive, but like disregarding of people, the needs and rights and feelings of, humans. But then on the other level, if you go to an extreme, it seems like non-functional in the sense of getting things done, getting things done on time.
Chaotic.
And again, kind of coming back to that balance.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, I talk about, the tight, loose mindset when it comes to individuals and families in the book. And we have a quiz on my website.
That I have taken. I took it this morning before we talked.
And, truth be told, I veer kind of loose. And my husband, I mentioned, veers kind of tight. He's a lawyer. She needs to veer tighter than me because of his industry. And we also, everyone has a default setting on the tight, loose mindset based on their histories, their own childhoods, their culture, their gender, occupation. And of course, we can, even when you're very loose, when we go into a library or a movie theater or a symphony, we can tighten up. Yeah. Or we go to parties, we might be more loose. So, these are things that are kind of dynamic, even if we have a sort of preference. But one of the things I talk about in the book is how much we need to negotiate these differences. So I study negotiation. And so right now we've been talking in the household, okay, what domains do we need to be tight in? And what domains can we looser in? And we talk about with the kids. These poor kids, they're going to need some therapy when they're older for having a mother as a cross-cultural psychologist. But, it's very interesting to start thinking about what domains do we need to have rules around and where can we give a little more slack? And in our household, I think much to Todd's dismay, we came to the conclusion that some domains like your schoolwork, your health, how you treat each other need to be pretty tight. But maybe, your appearance and your messiness can be, we can have a little more slack on that. Right. So, or how we load the dishwasher. Todd and I always have this constant hysterical, banter about this. He's like, he's just disgusted by how I load the dishwasher. It's all messy. It's like.
I also load the dishwasher incorrectly. I feel your pain. Okay, but I make a heck of a bed.
We're going to have a little support group. So I guess my broader point is that we can negotiate when we start to feel like we're getting too tight or too loose. We can negotiate it. And I think that is an empowering thing. Once we have the language of tight and loose, we can start thinking about, wait, why might you veer tighter or looser? Like, these are conflicts can happen in all sorts of contexts, not just the dishwasher, but finances, as I mentioned, parenting, even on vacations with my extended family. I see tight loose really rearing its ugly head in the sense of some people like a lot of structure, and some people like a lot of spontaneity. And this causes conflict. And I think the way that I've come to think about it is that we need to think about what are our priorities on vacation. Okay, let's kind of negotiate. What's your highest priority for your spontaneity? Yeah. What's your highest priority for your structure? Let's kind of figure out a win-win agreement. Mm-hmm. So in any negotiation, it's really about, we can't get everything we want, but what's our priority? Yeah. And often we prioritize very different things. So it makes for a lot of integrative possibilities, win-win possibilities.
That is such a good message. Well, and just like the takeaways, for people in relationships listening to this, like I think especially under times of stress and there's a lot of newness happening. So like I know even at my house, I have become tighter when it comes to like, cleanliness and doing things that I might not always do, but looser in some ways. Like my kid is watching more screen time right now, just as we're like sorting through all of the whole childcare stuff. So there's these fluctuations.
Yeah, that's right.
But what I hear you saying is that there's, unless you're like at extremes, there isn't really like a right or wrong way to be, but it's more about couples being able to talk about their differences and their preferences real openly and then build that bridge to the center is that as long as both of you generally agree on what's happening, then it'll be okay. But like what we see now happening in couples counseling is people, I think by virtue of their anxiety, wanting either stricter measures that their partner is not complying with, or a partner who maybe is a little bit looser and lower anxiety, being like, calm down, you're not going to die. And then that person, the person who is feeling more afraid, feeling like minimized emotionally. And so it's hard to find that balance, I think, in a relationship.
Yeah. And then it's sort of, okay, what are the domains that are most important to you in terms of, sanitizing or, and what are most important domains for you to still feel that you have slack in and you could be looser on. I do want to mention that, lots of our work shows that under threat, and you kind of hinted at this, people do naturally tend to tighten up. It makes a lot of sense. Like if even at the national level, we study this, the histories of countries over 100 and more years, when we have an instant threat in the laboratory, for example, we can see that people desire stricter rules. Like there's some kind of intuition we have as humans that say, you know what, in these contexts, we can't solve this situation by ourselves. We better have some rules.
Right.
I think to your question earlier about Corona, it's a really fascinating question. And I've written about an op-ed recently, came out in the Boston Globe, that was arguing that the U.S. needs to tighten up. And I'm not trying to say that we need to become more like China or Singapore, but I think that the way I think about it is that rules help to keep people safe. It's not to be controlling. It's temporary. We hope it's not. We don't need to think about shifts to tightness as being like permanent. Yeah. But Americans in general, not everybody, but of course, but have a little bit of dissonance or conflict over sacrificing autonomy and liberty for constraint and rules. Yeah. And it makes sense. We've been separated by two oceans from the rest of the world. We've had very little chronic threat in our history. Yeah. We do have, obviously, differences in the country around issues of threat, but nevertheless, if we were in context chronically with threat, we would probably be faster to say, okay, it's okay to have a lot of rules and know it's temporary. And right now we're studying how things like tight loose at the country level and also other factors like how efficient are the governments, how is that affecting the spread of the virus? And so I'll be able to report back on that research pretty soon because, I think that, again, it's harder for us to kind of think about rules as being protective when we're not chronically used to having to deal with tightness.
Right. And finding that balance between protective rules that keep most people safe, and also, like I saw something online the other day that there was a private manufacturer who found a very fast test that sampled like the DNA or RNA, I guess, of the virus, as opposed to looking for antibodies. And it could be done in 5 minutes in doctors' offices and like zillions of tests. And I was just thinking, like, that right there is the American way. That sort of heroic, like, private industry coming to save us, as opposed to the directives from the top.
I think that's right. And I think your point, and this gets back to the Goldilocks principle, I think we could be simultaneously strict and social distance and protect ourselves, but we can also be super creative. That's our mantra. That's our biggest strength is our creative spirit. So I think both are really needed. And I think that if we can get that balance, then we'll be in much better shape as a nation. And other loose cultures also have the same both, kind of liabilities, but also strengths.
Yeah. And hey, I know we're coming up on time and you have a hard stop here in a couple of minutes, and I want to be sensitive to that. But I have another question for you. One of the things that I have been seeing in my role, not so much as a coach, but like as a psychologist in clients, that I have and people that I've known for a long time, I have been seeing an interesting thing happen just in terms of like individual psychology around specifically anxiety, which is that my clients who, and I have always conceptualized this, so is, I don't know if you're familiar with like Myers-Briggs personality testing, but there's like a J subtype, which tends to be more rule-bound and planning and if this, then that, and kind of future thinking, and the P type, which is more sort of loose and in the moment, and I think really correlates with what you've been talking about, and that's just how I have conceptualized it in the past. But people that have that tighter mindset where like these are the rules and this is what's supposed to happen and this isn't happening and this is what is going to happen, but it should happen, but then this could happen, are absolutely anxious stress balls right now. Whereas people that I think have a more flexible mindset in general and are a little bit more like present moment focused and like are fine from like a mental health, psychological well-being. Not fine. I mean, there are real threats, but have you seen any of that play out in your research in terms of like mental frameworks and anxiety specifically?
Well, I haven't looked at anxiety. It's a really super interesting hypothesis. I think we do know that loose cultures, and perhaps by extension, people with looser mindsets, are more adaptable. Like, change is not as scary. And that makes sense because tight individuals with mindsets, people with tight mindsets and tight nations, what's different is dangerous. What's kind of new is novel and scary. And I think part of it suggests that we need to, when we think about changing, we need to have incremental change for people who have tighter mindsets. Like it takes a little longer to change. And we know that tight cultures take longer to change. In the corona context, we find something very different, though. This is the hypothesis, is that tight cultures are more swift to react to threat in terms of cooperating and coordinating their action. So, but in terms of like adaptability in general, I think that you're onto something. That I think that's one of the benefits, that openness versus order trade-off I was talking about. So I think that it's, I imagine it's really causing a lot of anxiety for people who are coming from those tighter spaces. Well, and I think also a lot of newness, perhaps for people too, who are used to going with the flow and now really need to be thinking more deliberately about how they're doing things in order to keep themselves safe and their family safe. And again, I think if there's one major takeaway from this conversation, it's the idea of balance and understanding different perspectives and really attempting to achieve consensus, even if it's within yourself, like some mental flexibility versus some rules. Totally. Well, this has been such a fun conversation. I know. I feel like we became good girlfriends over this conversation.
I know. I wish we had more time to talk. But briefly, if my listeners would like to learn more about you and your work and your book or take your quiz, where would they go?
So you can find everything, probably more than you want, at my website. It's michelegelfand.com. And on the website, I have a Tight Loose Mindset quiz that gives you a sense, again, in general, even though we vary by situation, where you fall on the spectrum of tight loose, and it gives a little bit more information about how it can be applied to everyday relationships and organizations and conflicts. And then on the website I have all my research articles, and then also op-eds and other stuff for the popular press, and more information about the book for anyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to read all of them.
Let's do it again. But next time we'll tighten up and it won't take so long.
But we're both loose. I am loose, and as you shared, you are loose, so you know. But it was also totally fine that we had to reschedule 9 times because it doesn't really matter. So
thank you so much for having me.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you again. I know you have to get...
Losing up my grip. Who else is gonna be there for you? Losing up my grip. choose it.